Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a big honor and pleasure for me on behalf of the group of authors to present you the results of this systematic review. I have nothing to disclose, and it's well known that the Caprini risk score is the most validated risk assessment tool to predict hospital-acquired VTE, particularly post-operative VTE. But however, there is a high inconsistency in the interpretation of the Caprini score, particularly in those patients who have 5 and more scores and belong to the group of the high risk. The previous studies and analysis showed that this group of patients may be very heterogeneous, and there are some specific thresholds which are associated with the higher VTE risks that could be identified inside this group of the patient, and maybe it could be divided in the some different subgroups like highest, very high, and extremely high risk. And also there is a high heterogeneity in the interpretation of the Caprini risk score, and many authors of different trials are developing their own thresholds which are associated with different VTE risk, and only 25% of all trials are using the original thresholds that were developed by Professor Caprini. So taking all of this into account, we designed this systematic review which was aimed to estimate the specific thresholds of the Caprini risk score that are associated with the increased individual risk of venous thromboembolism across different medical specialties. So we performed this systematic review according to the protocol which was developed according to the PRISMA guidelines, and this systematic review was done in March 2022, and we included in the analysis only those trials which demonstrated a positive correlation between the Caprini risk score and the incidence or risk of hospital-acquired venous thromboembolism, and where we could extract the number or risk or percentage of the VTE events in the different patient subgroups according to their Caprini risk score. And we did not include in this analysis the negative trials without correlation between the Caprini score and the risk of venous thromboembolism. The primary outcome of our analysis combined any asymptomatic or symptomatic deep vein thrombosis, superficial vein thrombosis, and pulmonary embolism, which was detected within the period of observation according to the criteria of the original trials. And we performed analysis in the subgroups of patients of different medical specialties as was designed. The quality assessment was done by the ROB2 tool for the randomized clinical trials and Newcastle-Ottawa scale for non-randomized trials. And initially we tried to make the standard meta-analysis, but it was impossible due to the high heterogeneity of the trials. That's why we decided to make some limited pooling of the data of those trials in which the patient were stratified in the similar subgroups across the different specialties. So actually we found 68 positive studies which combined more than 4 million patients, and there were 55 cohort studies, 11 case control studies, and 2 randomized controlled trials. Here you can see the results according to the different specialties. 4 studies combined the medical and surgical patients, and most of them received chemical or mechanical prophylaxis, and the highest VTE risk was observed in those who had 9 and more Caprini score. Medical patients were assessed in 3 trials. Most of them received prophylaxis, and at the top of this prophylaxis, the highest VTE risk was associated with a Caprini risk score of 9 and more. In COVID-19, 2 trials were performed. All patients received chemical prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 7 and more Caprini scores. In cancer patients, there was the highest number of trials. There were 17 trials, and patients received chemical and or mechanical prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 9 and more Caprini scores. In burns, only 2 trials were identified, and patients received chem prophylaxis and not, and the highest VTE risk was observed in those who had 9 and more Caprini scores. In trauma and orthopedics, 5 trials were observed, and patients received chemical and mechanical prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 11 and more Caprini scores. In urology and gynecology, only 3 trials were identified, and patients received chemical and or mechanical prophylaxis or did not receive any prophylaxis in most cases, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 5 and more Caprini scores. In muscular surgery, 3 trials were identified. Patients received chemical or mechanical prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 7 and more Caprini score. In head and neck surgery, 7 trials were identified with mechanical pharmaceutical prophylaxis, sometimes with chemical prophylaxis, and the highest VTE risk was observed in those who had 9 and more Caprini score. The population which combined general surgery and some mixed surgery was the highest, more than 4 million of patients in 7 trials. All of them received some kind of prophylaxis, and the highest VTE risk was observed in those who had 11 and more Caprini score. In thoracic surgery, only 2 trials were identified, both without prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in those who had 5 and more Caprini scores. In plastic surgery, 9 trials in which patients received mechanical with or without chemical prophylaxis, with the highest VTE risk in 9 and more Caprini score. And the last was critically ill population with 6 trials with prophylaxis, and the highest VTE risk in those who had 9 and more Caprini scores. So here you can find the final tables that summarizing the VTE risk that was observed in different trials with different medical specialties. As you can see, in all trials we can see that the risk further increasing in patients who have 5 and more Caprini scores. So we can divide in this standard group of the high risk some subgroups, like from 5 to 8 scores, where we can see further elevation of the risk from 9 to 10 score and 11 and more score. And in this group, which can be called as extremely high risk, even at the background of the standard prophylaxis, we can see the incidence of VTE of 10 and more percent. And of course, all these thresholds they're dependent on the specialty, on the type of VTE prophylaxis, on the type of surgery, on the reported outcome, and the time of observation. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude that Caprini score is really a highly validated risk assessment model for VTE in many medical and surgical specialties, and in most cases there is a further increase in the individual VTE risk in those patients who have from 7 to 11 Caprini risk score, so they need special attention and special, more escalated prophylaxis. But however, there is still some specialties which needs to validate Caprini score inside them and to establish specific thresholds. Thank you very much for your attention.